Hey there, I'm Ari from the Tech Buyers Guru, and I've got another product review for you here on the channel today. This time around, I'm checking out InWin's B1 Mini-ITX case. It comes in just under 8 liters. It's really stylish and it's incredibly affordable, under $90 with an included 200 watt gold rated power supply mounted inside. So it really competes kind of in a class by itself, but there are a couple of competitors that I will be benchmarking it against. Now, just to clear the air here, I know there are cases out there that are smaller in terms of volume that can fit huge video cards and really high performance gear, but they cost a whole lot more. So this is targeting a completely different class of users. These are bookshelf systems. They're not intended for high performance gaming systems. They won't even fit a video card. So if you're looking for a case that fits a really high-end video card, you can stop watching right now. These cases are not the ones you're looking for. But if you want an affordable alternative to a desktop PC where you can build either an office PC or perhaps a family PC in a very small chassis at a very good price, these cases are going to be the ones you want to be looking at. Now, the InWin B1 is relatively new, just released in summer of 2020, and I'm going to be comparing it against two different cases. But in this first episode, I'm just looking at the Antec ISK110. This has basically set the standard for bookshelf PCs for many years. It is not a new case, but it still looks great. And I really have to hand it to Antec. When they designed this case practically a decade ago, they really knocked it out of the park, and it's definitely stood the test of time. So in this video, I'm going to be comparing these two directly against each other in terms of thermal benchmarks. Now, this is actually a three-part series. So in my second video of the series, I'll be bringing in the Silverstone ML10. This is a brand new case, just released this month, August 2020. It's so new that Silverstone doesn't even have the power supplies out yet that will work with this case. So that'll come in a couple weeks when I do go ahead and test that with the new power supply that's going to be shipping soon. And then I'll bring that into the benchmark. So we'll have all three of these cases into benchmarks. And in my third video of the series, I'm going to be equipping one of these cases with some aftermarket coolers. Now I have the coolers sitting here. I'm going to be using a Gigabyte motherboard, and then, like I said, we have 4 and potentially more low profile coolers that we brought into the mix and used in one of these cases. Frankly, I haven't decided which case I'm going to use yet. I know I can't use the Antec because it only has clearance for 47 millimeter tall coolers, and some of these actually are almost 60 millimeters tall. So it'll be in one or the other of these two cases, but really it depends on how the benchmarks go in my first two videos. So there'll be a lot of action here for all of you fans of bookshelf systems. But like I said, today's video starts with the InWin B1. So let's take a tour of this case and see what it has to offer. The B1 looks striking thanks to this large tempered glass side panel. It stands upright in this cradle, which I wish attached, but at least it looks pretty good. If you want to stand it upright, you'll probably want to remove these feet, which look a little funny on the back, but they actually look great when the case is sitting on its side like this. So you have both options available to you. To pop the top, you just remove 2 screws and then you can take it right off and you get a view of the interior. Note it only has one USB port, which is a little bit limiting. On the side, we can see a meshed filter for the power supply's built-in fan. And then looking on the inside of the chassis, we see pre-cabled mounts for SSDs, which is great. It has the SATA cables and the power cables pre-attached for the 2 cradles there. The fan is an 80 millimeter model. It's set to exhaust out the top. You can easily remove it if you want to replace it with another 80 millimeter fan. All right, now that I've shown you around the InWin B1 chassis, let me talk about the platform I've selected to test this case and the other cases in this video series with. Now, I actually posted up a poll not too long ago asking for viewer input on the question of whether I should use AMD or Intel. And most people said AMD because it does have the better integrated graphics. And of course, these cases can't use add-in graphics cards. I was actually tempted to go with Intel because it's what I've used in the Antec chassis for years, and the box stock cooler, which sits at 47 millimeters tall, actually fits in this chassis and comes with most low-end and mid-range Intel CPUs to this day. The Wraith series of coolers that come with AMD APUs are actually too tall for the Antec chassis. With that said, I did ultimately choose to go with the AMD Ryzen 5 3400G for this roundup. I have it mounted right here on my Gigabyte Aorus I board. Now, there is one catch, and that is I have my Wraithspire cooler mounted here, but I can't use it because not only will it not fit in the Antec chassis, it won't fit in any of these chassis. So I'm going to have to remove this. And then the question was, well, what cooler am I going to use to provide apples to apples benchmarks? Well, I could have gone with the Wraith Stealth. It doesn't come with the 3400G, but I had one on hand, and most people can go out and buy one of these if they really want. But ultimately, I didn't think that this really solved my problem because it still wouldn't fit in the Antec chassis, and one of the ML10's configurations wouldn't work with this 55mm tall cooler either. So in the end, again, to provide apples to apples benchmarks, I'm going with the Noctua NH-L9A AM4. At 37mm tall, it will fit in all of these cases and all of their possible configurations. So with all that said, let's get this cooler off of here. Let's mount up the Noctua cooler and see how the InWin does. Getting the system mounted in this chassis was a breeze. InWin really makes it quite easy. There's a large opening to slip the motherboard in, and all the cabling was pre-done from the factory. Here's a view of it with that glass panel attached. I've added a little flare with some RGB RAM sticks. Here's the top vent where the fan will exhaust hot air. I was disappointed that the side of the chassis just had decorative fins. There's no actual vent here. Now at just under 8 liters, the InWin definitely towers over the other 4-liter cases in this roundup, but note that they don't have power supplies installed, so you do have to account for their half-liter bricks that they'll need to run. And also note, I actually broke the power leads on my Antec case when installing the motherboard because it was such a tight fit. It looks good once you have it built up, but honestly, it's not a lot of fun to work with. Moving into the benchmarks, here's idle at the desktop, and one thing I should note is that I did program in a custom fan curve on my Gigabyte motherboard because otherwise, even at idle, the fans were spinning up and down constantly as the CPU temps fluctuated. So here we are at 32 decibels. It's extraordinarily quiet. That is the noise floor of my testing environment, but it's because I did have those fans down fairly low, around 35 to 40%, and both systems were equally quiet. But the Antec is a lot cooler, particularly on the CPU and the M.2 drive. Moving on to my CPU load test, things get a little bit more complicated. Here I ran CPU-Z's built-in stress test for 5 minutes, and there's no doubt the InWin B1 was extremely loud at 53 decibels, but that's partly because I did allow its built-in fan to run at maximum RPM. I don't think you actually need it to run that fast because, in fact, while the CPU was running a little hotter here, some of the other temps were quite a bit lower, particularly that chipset, where the Antec really suffers because it doesn't have any airflow through the chassis other than what the CPU's cooler can provide. Now, as a thought experiment here, I ran the InWin B1 again, but this time with the glass panel removed, and I found that overall the temperatures were quite a bit better than in the Antec, and the noise levels were fairly acceptable as well. I think this provides some insights into how the B1 would perform if InWin were to ship it with a mesh panel. Hopefully that's something they'll offer down the line. I do think a lot of people would appreciate that option. Now I did find one anomaly here, which is that the chipset was quite a bit hotter when the glass panel was removed, and I think that there is a negative pressure environment when that glass panel is in place that actually benefits the chipset because so much air is being forced out the top of the chassis and pulled across the chipset. That doesn't happen when you have the lid removed and you have an open air environment. Now for my final benchmark, I turned to 3D Mark and its Skydiver benchmark, but specifically the combined test, which I looped for 5 minutes. This actually loaded up the GPU and CPU almost equally. Literally almost both were running at 100% the whole time. So this is a full load on the system. And what I need to mention right off the bat is that this system was pulling 120 watts from the wall. So I actually ran my Antec system with a different power supply than the one that was included. It uses a 90-watt power supply, and that would have been overloaded and likely would have shut down during this test. And even the upgraded external power brick I used was only rated to 120 watts. So really you're running at the ragged limit here for external bricks with the Ryzen 5 3400G. Note that when I ran the 3D Mark Firestrike test, which is more commonly used for high-end gaming PCs, I actually had some crashes, which suggests to me that I may have been exceeding the power limit of my power supply on that Antec system. On the other hand, while the InWin has plenty of power supply capacity, its thermal capacity is definitely challenged here. The CPU is running at 82 degrees and the decibel levels at 54, which is really, really loud, whereas the Antec was nearly silent. But again, take note that the Antec's reliance on the CPU cooler to keep the entire system cool is a little bit problematic. Again, the chipset is running quite hot in the Antec system because there's no airflow over it, whereas in the Inwind, that top exhaust fan is certainly providing additional airflow to the chipset, which is important for long-term longevity of your system. I believe that for a power-hungry CPU like the Ryzen 5 3400G, neither of these cases is really ideal. If Inwind does release a mesh version of the B1 with an exhaust fan, I think something like the 3400G would be possible, but for now, I wouldn't run the CPU in either of these cases. So in the end, what do I think of Inwind's new B1 Mini-ITX chassis? Well, I think it's a great new option in the market it's intended to serve. Now, I was pushing it pretty hard with the Ryzen 5 3400G. This is a 65 watt processor that was pulling 120 watts from the wall in my gaming test, and I think that's a little bit too much for this chassis in terms of thermals. It's not too much for the power supply though. I never heard the fan buzzing no matter how much I pulled from it. It's rated at 200 watts, it's rated gold, and I think that's all very accurate. This is a quality unit you're getting in this case, and remember it's included in that $85 price. Now the Antec I compared it against, yes, that had slightly better thermals in terms of the CPU. Some of the other thermals were actually worse though. It doesn't have the additional fan on top, so it couldn't pull that hot air away from the chipset or the VRMs, for example. And I had to upgrade the power supply on this unit to even run my tests because the included 90 watt unit isn't sufficient for the Ryzen 5 3400G. So who do I recommend this for? Well, I think if you're using an Intel Pentium or an AMD Athlon or maybe an AMD Ryzen 3, this is really a great case. And I think that you really have to consider how user-friendly it is. This is built around modern components. Look, in my testing, I actually clipped the power leads on the Antec because the B450 motherboard I had was simply too big to easily get in there. The Antec is designed around ancient motherboards that were really much smaller. They had smaller heat sinks, smaller shrouds, or no shrouds at all. Getting the B450 board into here was a struggle, and that is why I clipped that wire. It was so easy in Inwind because it's designed around modern motherboards that are simply bigger than they were 10 years ago when the Antec was designed. I also love that Inwind went ahead and made the cabling super easy. It has pre-cabled everything for your SSDs, and even the front panel power lead is a single block that plugs into your motherboard. It's just so easy, and they didn't have to do that, but they chose to do it to make it a better overall experience for the user. So if you're looking to build a low-cost and low-power PC, I think the Inwind B1 is a fantastic choice. I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Now, remember I do have some more videos coming in this series. Next up will be the review of Silverstone's ML10. Then I'll have a cooler shootout in either the ML10 or the B1. I have yet to decide that. As always, if you have questions, please post them down below. I do get back to everyone that I can. If you enjoyed the video, please do give me a like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time.